Hi everybody, thank you. I wanted just to tell you what's led me to be here today, and it's a little bit more than just talking about the law surrounding organ donation. And we've got Claire, I don't know where Claire is at the minute. Oh, she's there, from an NHS blood and transplant to answer the questions around the law change. Sorry, I'm really nervous. My experience is more of a personal experience with organ donation. And I think we're going to watch a video firstly to show you a little bit about what led me to be involved with it, and then I'll talk you through the story a little bit more.
My dad was a very generous, giving man. He was very hardworking. He wouldn't say no to anybody, and an amazing father, an amazing husband to my mum. The day my dad collapsed, he'd been for a physio appointment. Collapsed in the bus stop and had a cardiac arrest out of the blue. Was taken into a hospital and had to be put on a life support machine. We were told there was no hope, and he had to be put back into an induced coma at that point until it was time to say goodbye. My dad actually wasn't on the organ donor register, but he has ended up being an organ donor through his death. It was something we were asked when we were told that there was no hope and that we were going to lose him. I remember the conversation well with the organ donation nurse. It was very, very sensitively approached, and we kind of thought, well, what person is my dad? He's a giving, generous, loving person who'd give you his last breath, and it's probably something he would have done, and that's why we went ahead and made that decision. 12 months after my dad passed away, we had a letter sent from the organ donation team giving us details of who had benefited from my dad's gift of life. There were 4 babies that had had tissue from his heart, so they're alive because of my dad. There was a man in his 60s who received a kidney, and a man in his 70s who had a kidney, and they're both doing really well. A girl in her 20s and a man in his 30s, they both received corneas and can now see because of my dad. I'm really pleased that the law's changing to the opt-out system shortly. I think it would be a lot easier for people, however, if they knew their loved ones' wishes personally. I think if we had have known my dad's wishes, it would have made it a little bit easier. Knowing the good that came out of such a tragic circumstance, it's really brought our family a great deal of comfort. It's put a smile back on our faces when we've thought about those babies that are going to grow up because of my dad, and people whose lives have been enhanced because of him. It keeps his memory alive.
So I am a trained nurse by profession, dealing with death and dying in a hospice for the last 7 years, and prior to that I've been a nurse for 20 plus years. When you're dealing with death and dying in a personal experience, so it's extremely different. So to tell you a little bit about our story, my dad was a very fit and healthy 70-year-old who ran rings around my husband on the golf course. He went for a physio appointment on the 23rd of June 2017 for a bit of a dodgy shoulder. He got a repetitive strain injury. He telephoned my mum on the way back and said, "Stick the kettle on, I'm just about to jump on the bus, I'll be with you in 10 minutes. And then I had a phone call then off the police asking me if I knew who this man was that he collapsed in the bus stop. So I didn't know any more about the situation and what exactly they meant by collapse. They couldn't give me any more information until I got to the hospital. So we all arrived, all the family gathered, and when we were allowed to see my dad, he was actually ventilated on life support machine in a medically induced coma, and we found out that he'd actually had a cardiac arrest in the bus stop and arrested a further 2 times on the way to hospital. So we thought at that time that there was no way that he was going to survive this, and that we'd be losing him very suddenly and unexpectedly. To tell you that the next day they managed to get him off the ventilator, and he was sat up in bed looking around intensive care saying to me, "Angie, look at that man over there, he looks really poorly." And I kept saying, "Well, Dad, you know, you got all those tubes yesterday and you were dying, Dad, you know, you did die, you died 3 times on the way to hospital. Don't be silly," he'd say to me, "that's ridiculous." So we were told by the consultant that they weren't sure why he'd had a cardiac arrest, but he was incredibly lucky, and you know, he was going to be just fine. Might need a few more tests, but you know, they were going to move him to a ward very soon after that day. So we were asked to go back to normal visiting hours, you know, and we were just thinking, you know, thank God he's going to be fine. And thank God for the person who initiated CPR in the bus stop, which was a teacher at the school next door to the bus stop. So the following day, I was waiting to go to visit him, and my mum phoned me in a panic saying that she'd gone to visit my dad and they wouldn't let her in, but they let all the other visitors in, and she was sure that there was something going on. So I rang the hospital and I actually spoke to one of the nurses who happened to have been a student of mine many years before, and I said, just tell me what's going on, why aren't they letting my mum in? And she said, Angie, just come to the hospital and come quickly. So obviously I knew that there was something seriously wrong. So when I got there, my dad had a headache that morning. He'd been sat out eating breakfast and just said to the nurse, I've got this really bad headache. And things progressed very quickly to the point where he had to be put back in an induced coma, and he was taken for an emergency CT scan of his brain. He'd had a catastrophic bleed. The scans were sent to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, who said there was just nothing they could do and it was a matter of time. So we were told, you know, just spend as much time with him, but at some point we will have to turn off the ventilator. So you can imagine the distress that we were all in. I remember one minute being at the bedside, talking to my dad, you know, telling him the usual how much we loved him, and the next moment was scooping me up off the floor. So at 4 o'clock the following morning, they still hadn't made the decision about turning off the machine, but we were expecting it at any time. I was approached by a nurse and I thought, well, I'm not sure what that uniform is. It's not the uniform for the hospital where we were. And then I quickly realised it was a specialist nurse from the organ donation team who'd come to ask us about donating my dad's organs. So we had never spoken with my dad about organ donation, and my mum said in all of our marriage he'd never ever mentioned it, as most people probably don't mention it with their loved ones. I know in my 20s I had an organ donation card, registered my intent to be a donor, slipped it in my purse and probably never thought about it from that day to now. And my dad wasn't listed as an organ donor. So to make that decision, not knowing was it the right thing to do, is it what he wanted, we were just in absolute turmoil. It was really, really sensitively approached. The organ donation nurse was amazing. She gave us so much time. She sat and explained everything really gently to us, to me, my mum and my sister who were in the conversation at the time. And I remember my mum, who's a former nurse herself, and my sister being absolutely horrified at being asked. They said, no way on earth is anybody touching him. He's not being cut open. Nobody's taking bits from him. And we're just absolutely appalled by being asked that question. We were losing the dad and the husband that we loved dearly. I, at that time, put my nurse's hat on, and I understood why the questions were being asked of us at that time. So I asked for a little bit of space, and I spoke to my mum and my sister separately and said to them, a lot of good could come out of this situation. There's nothing we can do. We're going to lose Dad regardless. We've already been told the bleed is catastrophic. But we could potentially save people's lives. So we spoke about the kind of person that he was. He was a giving, very generous man. He'd probably give you his last breath if he could. And we decided actually to go ahead. My mum had still got those niggling doubts, so was it the right thing to do? We're not quite sure. Anyway, we decided to go ahead. One of the loveliest things that has ever happened in such a difficult circumstance was my mum didn't really want to sign the paperwork, but as next of kin, she was required to by law. So the donation nurse said to us, well, why don't you all sign it, all three of you, and then the burden's all of yours. So that's what we did. And we went back to the bedside, and the transplant teams were called in, and it's a bit like a military operation. You've got constant reports from the bedside going back to theatre about how he's doing as the ventilators turned off. And 3 hours, 10 minutes later, he passed away with us at his side. And because he died of a heart-stopping kind of death, not a brainstem death, you get 5 minutes only to say goodbye before that person's whisked to theatre. That was incredibly difficult. You kind of wanted to run down the corridor with him. So obviously after we'd finished doing what we needed to do at the hospital and went home, we had a phone call to say that they had successfully retrieved both kidneys, both corneas, and they were using his heart, not to transplant as a beating heart, because obviously it wasn't beating, but as to use for tissue and valves, and I could keep that heart for up to 10 years, which absolutely amazed me. In all my years of nursing, I'd never heard of this and didn't even think it was possible. So 18 months after he passed away, we had a beautiful letter that was hard to read, but absolutely amazing to hear. And it was a letter to tell us that a man in his 60s that had a kidney was doing really, really well, and he'd just come back from Norway on his motorbike and he was loving life. A man in his 70s that had a difficult start after transplant, but he'd been able to come off dialysis and he was spending precious time with his family, and he was very happy that he'd had the transplant. And this was the bit that choked me, and it still chokes me now, so bear with me. 4 babies, 2 baby boys and 2 baby girls, all born with congenital heart defects, had had tissue and valves from my dad's heart, and they just all reached their first birthdays and they were doing exceptionally well. So to think that those little babies are alive now and hopefully will have a long and happy future, that amazed us. And the fact that they can use that heart for 10 years, how many more babies and people might be saved as a result. And 2 people had gained the gift of sight. A 20-year-old lady and a 30-year-old man had both been given their sight back from my dad's cornea, so that was incredible. So the motto of what I'm saying to you today is, as with dying, organ donation is often thought of as a taboo subject. Nobody wants to think about it. It's never going to happen to us. You know, we're all going to live to old age and it's never going to touch our lives. If you'd have told me 2 years ago that I'd have been standing here today, I would have just laughed, really, and thought it was ridiculous. Who knows when it's going to touch your life? So what I'm saying to you all today is, if you take anything away from what I've said today, and this is what I've said to all my family, friends and colleagues, I'm probably sick of hearing it, to be quite honest, is just share your wishes. I'm not saying to you today, join the register or opt in or out as the law changes, which Claire will talk to you more about, I'm sure, is just share your wish. Whether you want to be an organ donor or you don't, just let your next of kin know. To be in that position where you're losing your loved one without warning, so very suddenly and tragically, and then you've got to make that difficult decision on top, it's incredibly painful to do. So just have a think. It doesn't have to be a massive thing. It could be a text message to your husband if you can't find the words to say. You could do it on the train on the way home tonight. You could have a conversation over the dinner table, and then you'd never have to talk about it again if you don't want to, but share your wishes. And that way, the same with your funeral wishes, your family will know exactly what you want and make the right wish for you. Even after that letter that we received, which brings us a massive amount of comfort, my mum still has that niggling doubt, what if it wasn't what he wanted? So obviously she has to live with that, but equally she's massively pleased with the outcome and the fact that people are alive because of my dad. Thank you for listening. Has anybody got any questions for either me or Claire?
Where's the video available?
It's on the NHS Blood and Transplant website. If you search for patient stories, and I think it says William's story or William Moore's story, MOORE, it's available on there. But what I'll do, if it allows me to, I'll put a link on my Twitter, and my Twitter details are on that speakers list as well.
Mine's not a question, actually. Sorry, I was maybe sob. I just wanted to thank you for sharing your story. My sister had a heart and lung transplant 18 years ago, and she had my kidney 6 months ago. So, no. But I guess I just wanted to say, on behalf of all the people that received your dad's organs and tissue, just a massive thank you, because it really does save and transform lives. And if it wasn't for the organ donor that my sister received 18 years ago, she would be dead. So thank you very much to you and your family.